Hello, hello, hello. Welcome to all you PMOs, PMEs, POMOs, POMEs, PIMQs, and all you LMNOPs. Welcome to The World, the podcast where we discuss all things related to the process of waking up, walking out, and moving on from life as a Jehovah's Witness. I'm Dr. Ryan Lee, a former JW with a doctorate in clinical psychology and a practicing therapist specializing in helping former JWs and other former cult members move through the recovery and rebuilding process. All right, before we dive in, just a couple of quick announcements. So first off, I am considering doing some kind of, maybe like a segment, possibly a full episode, on kind of a deep dive on a specific question or situation that you might have. So if this idea appeals to you, send me an email at drryanlee@drryanlee.com. Tell me a little bit about your situation. What are the sticking points? What are the struggles that you're having with it? And we can take it from there. You know, it might be one of those things where you just want to send me something in writing and I'll respond to it over the podcast. Or if the situation is right, maybe we could set up a call and do kind of a back and forth live sort of thing. Okay, and the second announcement is that there's a new scholarship available for Jehovah's Witnesses who are interested in pursuing higher education. If that has piqued your interest, stick around after the episode. I'll be sharing some more information about the scholarship. All right, so boundaries. What the fuck is that? This is part 2. We're going to elaborate a little bit more on some of the ideas that we covered in the first episode. Today we're going to be covering how to know when to set boundaries, different ways of setting boundaries, and how to handle it when inevitably setting boundaries doesn't go as smoothly as we would like. And then we'll tie it all together with some real-life examples that'll put some of these ideas into practice. Okay, so how do we know when to set boundaries? I'm going to elaborate a little bit on this idea, but I want to start again with the very simple understanding that if it doesn't feel good, that's all you need to know. That is enough of a reason to set some boundaries in order to rectify that situation. But sometimes we're actually pretty disconnected from what we're actually feeling. You know, we have so many mechanisms in place to try to just keep things flowing and keep up expectations of what we're supposed to do, and we often don't take enough time to go, how do I actually feel about this? So setting boundaries really requires you to get to know yourself better. And very often, we don't realize when our boundaries are being crossed until they've been crossed. So pay attention. How do you feel in your body? You know, think of a time when you met somebody when they were kind of overly touchy. You know, it wasn't a kind of organic thing, but they're sort of like touching you a little extra in this very intentional way that makes you feel, maybe some guy you met at the bar is touching you too much or inappropriately. That feeling, whatever you're feeling in that imaginary scenario, that's a good reference point. That's a blatant sign that your boundaries are being crossed and it doesn't feel good. Another example is you might walk into a store or maybe you're walking through the mall and somebody approaches you trying to sell you something and you communicate very clearly, I'm not interested in what you have to offer, but they keep pushing it on you. They keep sort of grabbing for your attention and keep trying to sell you on it. You know that feeling. That is another example, that feeling you get when you're like, I don't like this and I already expressed that I don't like it and you're pushing it on me. Or how about when somebody stops by your house uninvited without even sending a text message? You're just hanging around in your underwear on a Saturday morning, enjoying yourself with a big bowl of cereal, enjoying your peace that you've probably worked very hard to get to, and then there's just a random knock at the door. Hey, just thought I'd stop by. That feeling. That is another example. That's what it feels like when your boundaries are being crossed. So yeah, these are all reference points. If you start feeling like this throughout your life in different scenarios, again, even if you don't really understand why, but when you get that cringy sort of retracting, repulsion sort of feeling, that's generally a sign that some kind of boundary is being crossed and needs to be adjusted. Okay, so let's talk about how to set boundaries, ways of doing it, language to use. Initially, whenever we have to set a boundary, it's best to be simple, direct, and ideally kind. You don't need to over-explain. You don't even need to understand in the moment why you don't like something, as I mentioned. It's fine to act on the simple fact that it doesn't feel good. And here are some good, simple phrases to memorize and keep in your pocket. I'm just not feeling it. That doesn't feel good for me. Or That's not going to work for me, but let's come up with a different plan that'll work for both of us. Or sometimes it can simply be, please don't do that. It makes me uncomfortable. Now, I know you guys. When I say those things, I'm sure so many of you are just squirming in your seats at the idea, the audacity that you would say such outrageous things. But I want you to take a second and just really sit with that. First of all, imagine being on the receiving end of that. Would that feel comfortable? No. I mean, if somebody spoke up, it's always a little awkward. But are you going to get angry at them about it? Are you going to throw a big fit? Are you going to resent them forever? No. You're just going to take a second to adjust and move on. And I'd really like for you to step into the acceptance that this is okay for you too. It's okay for you to say these things. I'm going to say them one more time because I think they're important, they're easy, they're go-to, they work for almost any situation where you're not comfortable. Number 1, I'm just not feeling it. Number 2, that doesn't feel good for me. Number 3, that's not going to work for me, but let's come up with a different plan that'll work for both of us. And finally, simply, please don't do that. It makes me uncomfortable. Here's a few other phrases you might use if maybe you're not sure you want to set a boundary, but something kind of feels off. So you might say something like, let me sit with that. Or, I'll give that some thought and get back to you. Or, I'm not really sure how I feel about that, but I'll let you know. All of these phrases are perfectly acceptable. They can be used in lots of different situations. And if anybody has a problem with you saying these things, watch out for that person. That is not a person that you actually want to probably get too close to, because it's a sign that they don't have a vested interest in you feeling comfortable and you making choices that feel right for you. Now, I want to add in, too, sometimes it's a situation where someone crosses a boundary that they had no way of knowing was a boundary for you. But it is, and you get a little triggered. And in these cases, I would just try to be careful, Don't use a shaming, angry, or annoyed tone to let them know you don't like their behavior. You can, and it's okay, but it'll create a little extra friction. Instead, maybe start with phrases like, I know you meant well, but this is how I feel about this thing. Or in some cases, I know it's a little unusual, but I have a thing about this, and then just share that thing. This increases the odds that it's going to be received better, because it's acknowledging that just because you're expressing a boundary doesn't mean you're making a judgment of them. And then there are some situations that require you to be a little bit more explicit about what you're expecting. For example, you might lend someone some money, and because you want to be an agreeable person, you say something like, oh yeah, pay me back whenever it's convenient for you, no rush. Now, if you actually feel that way, then fine. But chances are that you actually have a clear sense of what an appropriate amount of time would be to get paid back. If 10 years go by and you haven't heard anything back from them, you're most likely going to be pissed. And this is the problem, because situations like that happen when you're not clear about your expectations and the agreement. And a situation will arise that creates more stress for you. So in this scenario, a certain amount of time goes by without hearing from them, you'll start to feel upset. And most likely you'll do one of two things. The most common thing I see, because as ex-Jehovah's Witnesses, we are very much people pleasers, we'll end up trying to talk ourselves out of our feelings. Partially because our feelings are uncomfortable, and partially because we really want to avoid the need of any type of confrontation. So you might convince yourself, well, money's not that important, I don't really need it, or make up some reason to excuse their lack of repayment. But both of these essentially are just a way of avoiding feeling what you really feel about the situation. The other scenario is you just outright start becoming resentful of the person and thinking poorly of them, and it strains the relationship, and anytime you see them, it's uncomfortable. But to be fair, not to pick on you, you did say, pay me back whenever it's convenient for you. So because you set that kind of sloppy agreement from the start, you created a situation that is now a problem you have to deal with. Anyway, this is all to say that it's a good thing to aspire to be clear and honest with yourself about what you want and need in any given situation that requires an agreement, and be really honest up front. Another thought is that you can be proactive about your boundaries. So again, going on the example of maybe you're not super comfortable with a lot of touch, and maybe you find yourself in situations where people go in for a hug and you just let it happen because you don't want to be annoying or whatever. But you can be proactive And just at the beginning of the interaction, when somebody leans in, you go, oh, no, sorry, I'm not a hugger, but I'm a handshake person, or whatever. Another example of proactive boundary setting. Let's say you're going on vacation with a friend, and maybe you're a little bit of an introvert. And maybe your friend is an extrovert and wants to do everything together all the time, all day. Now, if you don't say anything about it, chances are you're going to find yourself in a lot of situations where you are prolonging the connection and interaction past a point that feels comfortable for you, and you'll just be constantly sort of figuring out that line throughout the rest of the trip. Conversely, you can just say at the beginning, hey, just a heads up, I'm a bit of an introvert and need some alone time to recharge, so I may go off on some solo adventures or maybe stay back at the hotel sometimes. And that's fine. And you put it out there, you set the expectations, and there's a higher chance that the vacation is going to play out a lot smoother now. Okay, so we've talked about some examples of how to set boundaries and a little bit about what it might look like when they go smoothly. But, as you can imagine, very often they do not go smoothly, particularly when we're dealing with people who are still physically and mentally in. Ideally, you're always striving to cultivate a life where you're surrounded by people who value reciprocity, respecting others, and not making people do things that they are uncomfortable with. If you have established that life for yourself, then you can skip this next section. But yeah, we're going to talk a little bit about how to deal with people who do not respect boundaries. So first, let's touch a little bit on our own mindset when we go into these, because this is important. Our expectations are important. We imagine that when it's time to set a boundary, that people will respond in an agreeable manner. We might even add something like, I'm working on setting boundaries, and I'd really appreciate if you could help me with that. And we expect things to go smoothly. And then we are shocked or angry when the person ignores our boundaries, tries to invalidate them, or make us feel bad about setting them. Holding too tightly to this expectation is creating problems for us because we're going to get thrown off our center, we're going to lose our cool, we're going to become very upset that it's not going the way we would hope it would go, and we're going to get a little nervous and edgy, and it's going to make everything more difficult. So I would go so far as to say as you're starting to do this initially, prepare that each situation, expect that it will come with the friction. Then it won't throw you off so much. And this is especially true when you know you're going to be talking to somebody who is very likely to invalidate your feelings. Now, it's important to keep in mind that setting your boundaries is not about forcing someone to change their behavior or getting them even to understand or approve of the boundary that you're setting. This is only about drawing a line about what we will tolerate or won't tolerate and communicating it clearly. And if the person continues to cross our boundaries, we'll take necessary steps to remove ourselves from the situation in order to protect our boundaries. That might be removing yourself from the situation temporarily until the person concedes to respect your boundaries, or in some cases, it may mean severing that relationship altogether. But again, it's not about forcing them to do what you want them to do. It's just making it clear that if they don't respect the things that you need respected, that you're going to remove yourself from the situation. And let's be clear, whether you're dealing with a full-blown narcissist, which are notorious boundary crossers, or just an average person, most people want what they want, and they'll continue applying pressure if they think it will result in getting what they want. Everybody does this. Good people, bad people, we all do this, most of the time unconsciously. And this behavior can be subtle or overt. So here's some examples of subtle behavior. They might respond, you set a boundary, and they'll respond with some kind of snarky, oh, I see how it is, or some equivalent of an eye roll. They might continue to try to change your mind by reiterating their perspective, or simply keep talking as if they didn't even hear what you said, like it didn't even register. Overt pressure looks like accusing you of not being a good person because of the boundary you're setting, or because you're not giving them what they want, or ridiculing your boundary, making fun of you, thinking you're overreacting, oh, you're being too sensitive. And it may even go into like a threatening level, where they're doing a tit for tat kind of thing, where they say like, oh, well, if you're going to be like that about it, then I'm going to be like this about it. These are all just different strategies to get you to abandon what you know to be good for yourself. And again, whether they're good people or bad people, everyone's going to do this if they think they can get what they want out of the situation. So when you notice this happening, Instead of getting caught up or trying to respond or saying, I am a good person or justifying why your boundary is reasonable, just see it for what it is and use that as your cue to double down on whatever it is that you're saying. Not even elaborating, just repeating it the same way in a very clear tone of voice, because that's all that's happening is they're just trying to manipulate you, essentially, into changing your mind about something that's important to you. So this is also a good point to reinforce that it's not always one and done with boundaries. In fact, very often it is not. Sometimes it can work this way, again, particularly if you're with somebody who respects boundaries. But very often it'll require you to set that boundary multiple times. This is why it's a good idea to be clear on what you want and repeat the same thing over and over and over again until you get the desired result. It's not your job to help them understand why you're setting the boundary or make them feel okay about it. It is simply to be clear that this is something you will not accept. So yeah, as a general rule of thumb, start by stating your boundary once, repeat it again clearly if necessary. You might add, this is something that's important to me, and I don't feel comfortable being pushed. If you have to repeat yourself, you might use a slightly more intense tone to convey that you mean business. And after a couple of rounds of this, if your boundary is still not respected, it may be time to escalate. And yeah, in most cases, maybe all cases, it's best to remove yourself from the situation rather than yelling or unleashing an excessive amount of anger. But there are situations when expression of anger or aggression is appropriate, especially when the boundary that's being crossed is a physical boundary. But even outside of that, I do believe there are situations where it's appropriate to show your anger and maybe get a little bigger if you need to. And it's hard for me, from this side of the microphone, to be able to give you some examples of where that's right because it's going to be different for each person. I would just like to introduce the idea that anger does have its place, and I would encourage you to experiment with that idea and see what happens when you let it out. See how it goes. I know that sounds maybe a little crazy, but really, give it a shot, I'm not saying go buck wild and take out a baseball bat and smash somebody's car if they cut you off in traffic. But yeah, play around a little bit with, I'm going to actually unleash a little bit of tone here. I'm actually going to escalate. I'm going to get a little bigger. I'm going to let them know I mean business, And it may not always go well. But you'll learn something. I'll give you a quick example, and hopefully I'm not tarnishing my reputation here. But I am generally, like most of us, wired towards people-pleasing and doing the right thing and keeping the peace and blah, 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 and that's okay. But I've recognized that attitude has resulted in me tolerating and allowing things that are just not acceptable to me in favor of keeping the peace. So I had this idea floating in my head, and I'm like, okay, anger maybe is appropriate sometimes, but when? So I kind of had it in the back of my mind. I was looking for an opportunity to practice this. And sure enough, a couple of weeks ago, I was driving away from my house, and there's this very long, one-lane, dirt, rocky road that connects to the main street. And there's a general understanding with all of us in the community here that if you start to turn down that road, but somebody is already halfway down that road, it's your job to back out, to let them go by, and then you can proceed down the road yourself. And the general rule is whoever's closest to the entrance of that road, it's on them to back out. Now, in this case, one day I was driving down the road, and I was almost all the way down to the end of the road, and someone else turned onto it. And they were about 10 feet from the entrance of the road. And this guy, for whatever reason, decided to be a hard-ass bully about it and was determined not to let me by and insisted that I back down this very, very long rocky road backwards so that I could let him by. Now, I immediately recognized my usual instinct, which is, well, we don't want to make a fight and cause a problem, and this guy's really insistent, so fine, I guess I will back all the way down. And as soon as I started thinking about that, I'm like, ugh, I'm not doing that anymore. I'm tired. I don't want to do that. So then another voice came up and was like, all right, Ryan, this is your opportunity. Let's play with anger and see how this goes. Let's play with insistence. Let's play with setting boundaries. So first off, I started with the firm but gentle approach, which was, I'm not moving. You just need to move back 10 feet. If you just move back 10 feet, I'll swing by you, and we can move on with our day. And he's like, no, you got to back up. You got to back up. And then, I did take a second and try to explain, listen, man, it's a long way to back up and it's a pretty rocky road and it's not going to be good for my car and I'm just not doing that. And again, as this is going on, I'm very mindful of what's happening. I'm very mindful of what I'm doing. And I'm like shaking a little bit because I'm like, oh, confrontation. But I was like, nope, this is not happening. This is not going to end in me backing down this road. And so then I got a little bit more firm in my tone. Anyways, long story short, I escalated intentionally to a point where I was like, pardon my language, but I said, move your fucking car. It was actually a little more intense than that. But it was direct, it was loud, and it was a bit aggressive. And sure enough, finally he relented and moved his car back 10 feet after 15 minutes of this. And I went about my day. Now, you guys may have different opinions about whether that was the right thing or the wrong thing. In fact, I'll even say that even though I enjoyed engaging with this experiment, it left me feeling a little bit in knots afterwards because it's just not a way I'm used to operating in the world. And it felt different and a little uncomfortable, and I didn't like that it had to go that way. Now, personally, even though I felt uncomfortable, I did arrive at a point where I said I was actually proud of myself. I stood up for something I wanted. It's unfortunate that it had to escalate in order to get what I wanted, but I had every right to want what I wanted and to insist on it, in my opinion. But regardless of what you think of this particular situation, my point is, take an opportunity to experiment a little bit here. It has been drilled into us that it is never okay to use anger. It's never okay to use aggression. And while I absolutely believe it is best to avoid this, if at all possible, I would argue that having a mindset where it is never permissible and it is never acceptable creates more problematic situations. So, feel out what that line is for you. Experiment a little bit. Maybe it'll come out sloppy. Maybe it'll get a little messy. Maybe it'll make a bad situation worse. But inevitably, you'll learn something and it'll be fine and you'll move on and you'll learn more about who and how you want to be in the world. Okay. So let's continue putting this into practice with another example we're probably all more familiar with, which is family attempting to preach or draw you back into the organization. So one of the most common complaints I hear from clients about interacting with their JW family is the way that they find every opportunity to wedge in something about the JWs in order to preach to you. This might be as inane as always talking endlessly about what happened at the meeting this week. But often it goes a lot further, trying to insert guilt or fear, begging you to come back so that you'll be in paradise with them, or provoking you into arguments and trying to muscle you into seeing things their way. Now, when this happens, this is what's going on inside of you. I don't like this. I'm not interested in this. I don't like having to constantly defend my position. But in most cases, externally, you're not doing anything to convey how you're feeling. Instead, most commonly, you'll nod your head as your eyes glaze over and you start to dissociate. Or you may even go so far as to participate in your own misery by keeping the conversation going. Like, oh, that's so interesting. Oh, tell me more about that. Ugh. And then you may even further betray your feelings by saying, oh, yeah, I'll think about that. Or oh, sure, I'll read this literature you gave me. Or maybe I'll start coming back next month. All of these are ways of betraying yourself by not setting boundaries. And by doing that, you're ensuring that this intolerable situation will continue. As a result, you become locked in a fake, soul-sucking conversation and end up harboring resentment towards this person. You end up dreading coming in contact with them because every time you're in their presence, you're kind of miserable, You're in this semi-permanent cringe state, anticipating the inevitable moment when they'll wedge it into conversation and you'll be forced to be fake and feel gross about it. So, let's talk about what it would look like if we asserted our boundaries in this situation. You could wait for the topic to come up again and address it then, but many times it's better to be proactive about discussing it, which gives you a little more control about how the conversation plays out. And it might sound something like this. You might say, hey, there's something important I need to talk about with you. I know your heart is in the right place. Again, we're inserting kindness and empathy. But every time you preach to me, it makes me feel really uncomfortable. And I don't want to have these conversations anymore. Now, that could be enough, but you could also add, I'd really like to have a close relationship with you, but I'm finding that because of these conversations, I've been avoiding you. Because they make me feel so uncomfortable, and I want a relationship where we can be open and honest with each other. I know it's maybe hard for you to hear this, but I need you to understand that I've made this decision to leave the organization, and nothing you can say will make me change my mind on that. Now, if you're really lucky, you might get a respectful response like, I understand, or, yeah, that makes me very sad, but I can accept that. But of course, this is very rare. Much more commonly, you'll receive pushback. They might say something like, well, I don't know what we're going to talk about then. As if Jehovah's Witnesses is the only thing in the world to talk about. Or, well, I'm only trying to save you. Don't you understand how important this is? They might play the victim, don't you know how much this is hurting me that you're making this stand? Or they'll justify ignoring the boundary by saying, I'm sorry, but I just can't give up on you. Regardless of the particular response, it's all the same thing. They're ignoring your boundaries and insisting that they're going to continue acting in the way that they want to act. So, now we bring in repetition number 2 of setting our boundaries. This one's a little more clear and concise. I understand that this is difficult for you to hear and will require an adjustment for you. Again, we're using a little bit of empathy. But I need to be clear that I am not willing to discuss that topic anymore. And again, chances are good you'll get more pushback. They might say something like, well, I don't know if I can agree to that. And here's where repetition number 3 comes in, and what I suggest should be the last repetition. You might say, well, I respect your right to make decisions that feel right for you. But if you can't honor this request, I need you to know that that'll influence how much time I'll be able to spend with you. And if you insist on bringing up the Jehovah's Witnesses moving forward, I'll be withdrawing from the situation. And that's it. No need for additional back and forths. You've said your piece, you've made it clear what's going to happen if your boundaries are not respected. All that's left after that is following through with what you said. And again, expect that they will test you. They're going to be throwing little things in here and there to see if you're actually going to follow through with what you said. If you don't follow through, they will get the clear message that your words mean nothing, and they can simply ignore any boundaries you attempt to set with them. Your words need to be followed by consequences and actions in order for them to be effective. And yeah, in some situations, asserting yourself in this way will mean the end of the relationship. But much more commonly, especially when there's a foundation of authentic love in the relationship, there'll simply be a period of uncomfortable transition as this dynamic shifts, until everyone settles into an acceptance that this is how things will be from now on. They may not like it, but in most cases, they'll get used to it. Because in most cases, what's really most important is maintaining that communication and contact. And for those of you out there where this is not the most important thing, I am really, really sorry that you're in this situation, but please use that as a sign to cut your losses and move on from this relationship. Because if love, respect, and connection is not at the core of it, there's nothing good that can come from continuing down this road. Okay, so in closing, regardless of how you choose to proceed in any of these scenarios, all of this requires that we get comfortable with the idea that setting our boundaries will almost always result in others feeling some discomfort. If nothing else, just because they don't get what they want, and that's uncomfortable. And yeah, it's fine to move through the world doing our best not to create unnecessary discomfort. And in many situations, we can negotiate the circumstances so that everyone involved feels good about how things played out. But this is not possible to do all the time. And if you hold on to the idea that everyone must always feel comfortable and that you're responsible for ensuring that comfort, it will be extremely unhealthy for you. An inability to set healthy boundaries is a recipe for low self-esteem, social anxiety, a persistent and corrosive level of discomfort for you, and will ensure that you'll never feel fully at peace within your body. Conversely, the more you get better at learning and asserting your boundaries, you will learn to trust yourself more. Your inner child will feel safer, knowing that you won't betray their needs simply to keep the peace or concede to the needs of others. You'll feel more confident. Your self-esteem will improve. You will feel less anxiety and have more peace of mind and feel more capable of handling difficult situations. And yeah, when you first start setting them, I promise you, it will feel clunky and awkward. You may stutter or feel shaky. You may assert your boundaries in cases that you later realize was unnecessary. Or maybe you do it in a way that's more intense than the situation called for. All of this is totally normal and fine. It's okay, and it's part of the learning curve. Don't worry. You'll get better at it with time and practice, and it will eventually become more natural to you. And yeah, if you went over the top with it, it's fine to double back on it later, If it goes horribly awry, you can always follow up with that person and say, hey, I know I came on a little strong. I meant what I said, but I could have been a little more tactful with how I expressed it. And you might even share that this is a new skill that you're working on and you appreciate their patience. The important thing, though, in these particular cases is that you don't invalidate the boundary you set, but rather address the way in which you went about setting it. I say this because, due to the inevitable discomfort you will feel after setting a boundary, a lot of times you'll end up following up and undoing everything you did and being like, oh, I don't know what I was thinking, and I was just being too sensitive, and I'm just, you just start invalidating yourself and you just undo all the work you did. Because you feel so uncomfortable and you're desperate to apologize to resolve the anxiety that you feel about it. Don't do that. Stop it. If you felt something was off, then something was off that needed to be addressed, and we're just working on getting better at how to address it. Okay, this one ran a little bit long today. I hope I didn't overload you with too much information. Clearly, I'm very passionate about this subject, and I hope you found it useful. If you did, it would really mean a lot to me if you could hit that subscribe button, leave us a review, and pay it forward by sharing this podcast with other people who might benefit. If you have any questions, feedback, or ideas for future topics, or if you have a personal situation that you'd like to discuss and hear an answer over the air, email me at drryanlee@drryanlee.com or visit my website at drryanlee.com. Until next time, remember, you are brave, you are strong, and you are totally capable of not only setting, but following through with boundaries. And you, my friend, are not alone. Okay, so as I mentioned at the top of the show, there's a new scholarship available for former Jehovah's Witnesses who are interested in pursuing higher education. It's called the Make Your Truth Your Own Scholarship. This scholarship acknowledges the distinct challenges former JWs face, particularly around higher education, which, as we all know, is heavily discouraged. As a result, many former members find themselves unprepared for career opportunities, which inevitably leads to financial stress. This program not only assists with tuition, textbooks, and other educational costs, but it also opens doors to other possibilities. It's available to high school, undergraduate, or graduate students who were formerly part of the Jehovah's Witnesses. Now, I'll be giving you the address in case you're interested in applying for the scholarship, but I'm going to be honest with you. Right now, there's maybe about $600 in the fund and maybe about 30 applicants currently waiting approval. So what they really need right now is donations. So if you have a little extra money and you find it in your heart to donate that to help out some people that are pursuing education, your contribution would be very much welcomed and appreciated, and donors will receive a tax donation receipt. This is a really great way to help individuals forge a new path and achieve their educational and career goals. I hear from a lot of people that are looking for ways to give back or do something, having some kind of impact that either hurts the organization or helps the people that are leaving it. Well, this is your opportunity. It doesn't have to be much. Could be $5, $10, could be $100 if you're in that kind of position. Whatever you can contribute would be deeply appreciated. So if you're interested, I'm going to give you the full address, but it's kind of a mouthful. So I'm just going to start by saying probably the easiest way for you to find this would be to go to Google and put in quotes, "Make your truth your own," unquote, scholarship, and that'll take you right to the page. But just in case, the actual address is bold.org/make-your-truth-your-own-scholarship. I highly recommend going the Google route. That's going to be a little quicker for you. All right. Thank you so much for helping us out with this.